Chapter 6. Sunset. Virginia walked into the main library of Mason High. For such a small town, this school held a decent-sized sanctuary for its literature. It was composed of 2 stories. Stationed on either side of the main entrance was a staircase leading up to the 2nd story, which horseshoed the room and overlooked the lobby below. Both floors had aisles full of bookcases stuffed with volumes and volumes of books. Virginia walked up to the head librarian's desk in the center of the room. Only a single lady was currently at her station, typing on her computer. "Excuse me," said Virginia softly. The librarian looked up and replied with an even softer voice. "Yes, how may I help you?" Virginia glanced around the room for a quick second at all the countless bookshelves. Surely there has got to be some form of government document here. "Yes, I'm looking for a book of some kind that could give me maps and locations of this area of the mountains dating back to the late 1800s. The librarian's eyes got big and she puffed up her cheeks in bewilderment. "Well, now, let me see." She began typing on her computer again, searching all options. "What is this for exactly? A school project, perhaps?" "More of a personal project, actually. I just moved here recently." "Oh, I see." The librarian stopped typing and stared at her screen. "It says here we have a few options. First, we have an atlas that dates back to the early 1900s. We have a few copies of old newspapers on the library's website that date back as early as the mid-1800s. There is a short read called The Town of Mason, written by an early journalist who thought the town should be remembered. We also have records of who owned what land as far back as the early 1800s. Which one would you like to look at?" "All of them, please." "All of them?" The librarian stood from her desk and walked towards the left staircase at the main entrance. "Follow me, please." Virginia followed the woman up the stairs. The librarian grabbed a few books off the bookshelves and handed them to Virginia. They then walked downstairs where the librarian escorted Virginia to a computer desk by a large window at the far end of the room. She logged Virginia into the computer and pulled up the newspaper articles written by a press known as the Cold Creek Valley Newspaper. "Here you go," said the librarian. "I'll leave you to your homework. I hope that your project turns out well." The librarian walked back to her desk and resumed her work. Virginia stared back and forth at the computer screen and the small stack of books to her left. "Yeah, I hope so too." She picked up her first book, The Town of Mason, and began reading. Hours had passed and Virginia had burned herself out of energy on an enormous amount of material. She had found many connections. She saw the local newspaper's name appear more than once in the town of Mason, but nothing in any piece of literature she studied even mentioned the name Alaythia. To her amazement, she found Jeffrey Cohen, father of Rose Ann Marie Cohen, in the documents of land ownership in the late 19th century. Still, nothing spoke about anyone owning a piece of land known as Alaythia. She decided to research it for herself online. She typed in the search bar countless word phrases that she thought might help. Alaythia. Where can I find Alaythia? Directions to Alaythia from my current location. Who owns land called Alaythia? Alaythia, Tennessee. With all the searching she did, there was nothing she could do to locate this small property that was the romantic getaway for Rose Cohen and Burning Eagle. She opened her backpack and gently pulled out the diary. Looking around to make sure no one was watching, she held the book in her lap and flipped it to where she had last left off. "I was unsure if this was real or not. If it was, I did not want to wake up. I was free, rescued. Another had me in his arms. Judging by his countenance, I believed he was not there to harm me. Through the mask of war paint coating his face, I could see the gentle side of my protector. We flew for at least half an hour before landing at the edge of a forest. Still holding me in his arms, the warrior carried me deep into the heart of the woods. I looked into the Indian's eyes and asked him who he was. He replied, 'My name is Burning Eagle. I am here to protect you.' He kept addressing me off and on as Your Highness and Princess and even my princess. I will admit it was very frustrating to be addressed like this because he would not tell me why he called me these. He only said that I was of royal blood and it was only proper to address me as such. This was all that he would tell me for the time being, which made it all the more frustrating. It's hard to accept that you're part of a royal family without being told who that family is. However, I will be honest with you. My princess was my favorite. My mind could not escape the curious wings on his back. I asked him again if he was an angel. I told you once already, he said. I'm not an angel. Oral Muti, long live his kingdom, has given my tribe and me the wings of his people. We are a special group of elite warriors within his kingdom. Oh, how that made no sense at first. His reply only seemed to come up with more questions. Putting the first aside for the moment, I asked him who this one was, whom he calls Oral Muti. He told me that Oral Muti is the creator of Alaythia, known by a different name on Earth. He explained that Oral Muti, through his people of Amya, placed his spirit upon him and all of the men and women of his tribe, which produced the wings upon his back, the light within his stomach, and the fire that would engulf him when he fought. He said that if it were not for the spirit of Oral Muti flowing and resting upon his tribe and him, the darkness would have overtaken his tribe. I had no idea what he was talking about, but I was soon to find out. The trees around us began to gather in a row on either side of us, forming a corridor that stretched deep into the darkness of the forest. I could not see anything, yet the smell of pine was strong, and the touch of a cold breeze kissed my cheek. There soon appeared a light at the end of our trail. It was small and orange. We came up to where the light hung. It was a single lantern posted above the architecture of a Roman archway hewn of ancient rock. Underneath the lantern, etched into the chief cornerstone, were letters and words of another language. The Indian sat me down and walked over to the stone arch. He took a long wooden rod and placed it into the flame of the top lantern at the head of the archway. Bringing it down, he lit 2 more lanterns mounted on either side of the archway. Suddenly, a bright light appeared from within the arch's opening, followed by a burst of fire. The whole space of the archway was set aflame. The flame slowly turned into a bright light that consumed the entire entryway of the arch. The words upon the sign above the stone arch began to light up in a bursting flame. The Indian came back for me. Picking me up in his arms again, he walked towards the arch. I asked him what he was about to do, but he just said, "Trust me, Your Highness." So I did. He carried me through the opening and into another world I never knew existed nor saw coming, a world that completely changed my life, a world called Alaythia. Virginia shot a perplexed look at the diary in her hands. What in the world is this? Alaythia is a magical land? A fairy tale? Is this a joke? Where's the reality? Enough poetry. "Honey?" came a soft voice. "Honey." Virginia looked up and saw the head librarian standing in front of her desk. "Honey, I'm afraid that it's time to go." Virginia quickly closed the diary and placed it in her backpack. "But I've only been here for 30 minutes. "Honey, you've been here for almost 3 hours. It's 5:30. The library is closing. It's time to go." Virginia stared at her computer screen with lost eyes. 3 hours? No, I need more time. I need better answers. "Hey, maybe you could help me." "And what might that be?" asked the librarian, somewhat excited to assist. "I'm looking for a piece of property somewhere around this area. Its name might have been changed in the records if someone had purchased the land, obviously, but maybe the history of its name is enough to point me in the right direction. It's a section of land once called Alaythia. Have you heard of it? Does it mean anything?" The librarian chuckled and shook her head. "Oh, honey, that's just an old fable, a legend, better to call it. It was supposedly the land to which young lovers ran off to escape their old lives. Some say that a couple once ran off and supposedly found this land, but it did them no good to escape the inevitable. They were eventually found and then separated. Virginia's shoulders sank, and a look of hopelessness crossed her face. But surely there must be a place that was once possibly named Alaythia. I read— She stopped to correct herself. I heard that it was located somewhere in these parts and that it was an actual place rather than just some lover's secret hideout. The librarian smiled as if she knew this was coming. Yes, that is what the legend says also. It all started with a single love story about, a rich young girl and a poor Indian boy, I believe. That story was first told over 100 years ago. It then spread throughout this area. It has become this town's folk legend, something that has gone around for years, and the story has changed throughout those years too. Soon it was a rich man and a young Indian woman. Then it changed to an Indian man and a woman who fled off their reservation, hoping to find a new life outside the control of the white man. The story always attracts tourists who come here for the first time. It really helps to make our town more recognized, too. Oh, I could go on with all the different stories from that single fable, but I haven't the time. As much as I love to hear and tell such love stories, I must close the library. Virginia felt her brain go numb. She did not know whether to throw the diary across the room or to cry out of lost hope. All this time spent digging deep, all this time wasted over nothing more than just a mere fable, a tourist attraction? She threw her hood over her head, grabbed her backpack, and stormed out of the library. The librarian picked up Virginia's books and walked towards the stairs. She had only made it up to the first few steps before she stopped and noticed a man dressed in a dark trench coat with a black hood over his head sitting in the far right corner of the library. "Excuse me," she called out. "The library is closing. Do you need to check out a book?" The dark figure stood up from his seat. "Actually, you might be able to help me." He walked across the room and stood at the base of the staircase, looking up at the librarian. "I was waiting on a book from that girl who just walked out." "Oh, well, let's see if we can find it." The librarian fumbled through the books in her hands. "We have The Town of Mason and an old atlas containing maps of this region. Which would you like?" He shook his head in dismay. "You know what? I'm afraid neither of these is what I was looking for. I must have had the wrong book title in my head." "Well, would you like me to look it up for you quickly on the library computer?" "Oh, no, ma'am. That's all right." He looked towards the entrance of the library. "I'm sorry to change subjects with you, but that girl that left here seemed really upset about something, didn't she?" "Oh, yes. Poor girl. She was studying the location of some property that she thought existed, but she has run into a dead end, I'm afraid." "A dead end? How so?" "Poor girl. She was trying to find a place called Alaythia. I told her it was not a real place, just a story, and then she ran out the door." The man dressed in black stroked his fingertips along the edge of the books in the librarian's hands. "She asked you about that, did she?" "Yes, poor child. She looked so hopeful, too. Oh, if there ever were such a place, I would hope that she would be the one to find it." "I see. Is there anything else I can help you find, dear?" The young man raised his gaze and looked at the woman with a wicked smile and a gloomy green glow in his eyes. "Oh, no, thank you. I believe you've helped me find exactly what I've been looking for." He walked out of the library, leaving the woman alone to complete her last-minute tasks before closing. Virginia walked out of the school building towards her truck. The evening air was cold and damp. The smell of fall was strong. The changing leaves scattered across the town with orange, yellow, and red beauty. The asphalt was wet and slick. The sun was setting in the distance, brightening the land in a yellow-orange tone. Virginia took no notice of the nature around her. She was cold and started to shiver. With disgust at the dampness and chill of the climate, she pulled her hood farther over her head, although it did very little to block the coolness of the evening. With disappointment still weighing heavily on her heart and a frown spreading across her face, she walked to the parking lot's far side. Although she had been escorted to the back of the lot on her first day of school, she found it was where she liked to park. She hated to park up front, closer to everyone she did not know. Distance made her feel safe and secure. She reached the driver's door of her truck and frantically searched in her backpack for her keys. A small draft came across the lot, making Virginia shiver. Frustrated, she hastened her search. Finally, after a long journey into the depths of her bag, she found them. A sudden relief came over her, followed by more frustration as she looked at the 3 keys. Which one opens the door again? Another draft swept down over the parking lot. Shivering again, Virginia thrust the first key into the door. It did not work. Another draft, more ruthless than the one before, rushed around her. Stammering in frustrated nonsense, she wedged another key in, and with the turn of her wrist, the door unlocked. Quickly, she opened the door and hopped inside, closing it just as fast. Grabbing the steering wheel with both hands and leaning her head back on the headrest, she let out a little chuckle of relief. With her spirit lighter to be out of the cold wind, she slid the correct key into the ignition and gave it a turn. The lights came on, but the engine did not crank. Virginia's eyes got bigger. "Oh, no! Come on now," she begged as she tried it again. The lights came on again, but the engine did not turn. "Please, don't do this to me. Not now." Another attempt, but no change. Another attempt, still no change. Another attempt. Virginia slammed her palm into the steering wheel, clenched her teeth together, and yelled. Breathing steadily, she rested her head on the steering wheel. After a long moment of nothing but silence and the sound of her exhausted breaths, she decided to call her uncle. Reaching her hand into her backpack, she navigated her way into its depths in search of her phone. She was relieved to find it after the first try. After unlocking it and scrolling through her contacts, she found her uncle's number. She tapped on it and placed the phone against her ear as it rang. Many rings passed before she finally heard her uncle's voice on the other end. "Uncle Andrew?" she exclaimed. It was the first time she was excited to hear his voice. "My truck won't start, and I don't know why." "Yes, I'm still at school." "Okay, how far away are you?" Her eyes shot open even bigger. 45 minutes to an hour. She closed her eyes and just kept silent. After listening to her uncle's instructions, "Wait there, don't go anywhere," and that he is on his way, she replied, dejected, "Okay, I'll wait here then." After hearing one final word of assurance from her uncle, Virginia hung up and dropped the phone into her backpack. Groaning and shivering in her truck, she leaned her head back upon the headrest again. A loud bell chime echoed throughout the parking lot. Virginia had been resting for no more than a minute when the magnitude of the ring hit her hard. She opened her eyes and stared at the school clock tower in front of her vehicle. The bell continued to ring 5 more times, reaching a total of 6 rings. "That can't be right," she said to herself. Peering up through her windshield, she saw the clock tower reading 6 o'clock. "Great," she complained. "It will be dark by the time he gets here." She pulled her head back to rest, but something caught her attention. High above in the bell chamber of the clock tower, Virginia spotted something dangling over the edge of the dome structure. She squinted her eyes to focus more on the object. It was a pair of legs. Puzzled, she grabbed her backpack, hopped out of her truck, and stood in the parking lot, not taking her eyes off the legs. She tried to walk farther back to see if she could get a complete visual of who it was, but after walking about 10 feet back, she could not make out a description other than a pair of legs in blue jeans and hiking boots. The wind blew hard again, but Virginia was determined not to get back into her truck. She would either freeze in her vehicle or freeze while discovering who this person was. A new idea came into her mind. "There must be a way up there, right?" she insisted. She ran her arms through the sleeves of her backpack and dashed to the base of the clock tower. Sprinting around it, she found a door on the opposite side of the square structure. Ambling towards it, she checked to see if it was unlocked. To her excitement, the doorknob turned open. Biting her lower lip, she slowly opened the door. Then, using her best ninja skills, she quietly walked into the tower. It was very dusty and dirty inside the complex. The floor was solid concrete, and the sides of the walls were plastered with a coat of the same cement mixture. In front of Virginia was a staircase that trailed up the side of the wall, spiraling to the top. With little to no second thoughts, she slowly walked up the stairs, climbing to the very top. About a little more than halfway up the staircase, Virginia looked down and noticed the 30-foot rise looked a lot more intimidating from her current position than it did from the ground. She took a deep breath. "Don't look down," she ordered herself. "Just keep going, only about 10 more feet up." That excited her just enough to get the adventure back into her system. "That's right," she encouraged herself. "Just 10 more feet to go." After coaching herself, she continued her journey to the top. With achievement soaring through her heart, she reached the final step of the staircase. It opened up to a small platform. Bordering it was a hand railing built with 2x4s. A small wooden ladder leaned against the concrete wall leading up to a trapdoor in the ceiling. Without checking the stability of the ladder's footing, she climbed to the trapdoor. She looked, but could not find a handle to open the small door. "I'll just go with simply pushing it open." Okay, this is it. With thrilling tension bursting through her veins, she pushed her hand fast against the trapdoor, thrusting it open. Virginia looked up. Directly above her was the bronze bell that was ringing loudly earlier. "What the?" came a very startled voice from the belfry. "Who's there?" The voice sounded either frightened or angry or both. She thought about running for a second, but found herself answering the question. "My name is Virginia. I'm a student here." She waited for a response, but none came. Nervously, she continued to engage. "I'm really sorry if I scared you." "Virginia?" Virginia detected no sign of anger or fear from the voice anymore, but after she thought about it for a moment, that voice sounded familiar. She placed her hands through the trapdoor and onto the bell chamber floor. Then, pulling herself up, she stuck her head out of the trapdoor. She turned towards the sunset and saw Charles leaning his back against a pillar of the chamber, the back of his arms wrapping around it for support. He wore the same pair of blue jeans and hiking boots that Virginia identified below. He also wore a white long-sleeve shirt and his brown leather jacket. In his left hand, he held a spiral-bound notepad. "It is you!" he exclaimed. Motioning towards the center of the chamber, he placed his hands firmly on the floor and crawled over to meet her. "You gave me quite a scare," he said, chuckling. "I almost fell off the edge a second ago." He extended his hand to help her. Virginia reached out and took hold of his hand. With a strong lift of his arm, he helped escort her out of the opening in the floor. "Watch your head," he said, placing his other hand on her crown. She looked up and realized she had almost hit the bronze bell above her. "It's not very big up here, is it?" she said while crawling on her elbows underneath the large bell. "No, it sure isn't," he replied. "No bigger than about 15 feet in diameter." Virginia finished crawling out from under the bell and looked around for a moment. The bell chamber floor was an octagon base with a pillar in each corner. Above her, supported by the pillars, was a large dome from which the bell was suspended. Still holding her hand, Charles led her to the pillar beside his. "Be very careful up here," he said with extreme caution. "Do not stand up. I tried it once. I nearly fell off by a gust of wind." "I'll take that to heart," she said. She sat beside the pillar that Charles led her to. "What are you doing up here, anyway?" Charles turned back towards the setting sun and placed his legs over the edge again. A slight red blush crossed his cheeks. "Oh, nothing." Virginia glanced at the notebook in his other hand and turned her head as if to stare at him with one eye. "You climbed to the top of a clock tower in the evening to watch the sunset, bringing a notebook up here with you, all for nothing." Charles gave a little smile at her analysis. "I was writing." "I guessed that. Writing what, might I ask?" Charles froze for a moment. He then turned his head toward Virginia and replied sheepishly. "Poetry." Virginia raised her eyebrows. "Poetry?" "Yes, indeed." Virginia leaned back against her pillar, a bit surprised at what she had just heard. "So you volunteer to help my uncle on our ranch. Judging by how much you wear those hiking boots, you obviously can't wait to go explore something new. And now, to top it all off, you write poetry also?" She was on a roll. "For a guy who looks like he hits the gym every day of the week, I would never have thought you—" She did not catch herself in time. "I didn't just say that." Her strong, dominating spirit vanished, leaving her helpless and exposed. Charles looked up at her with a humorous expression on his face. Virginia felt like she could jump off the tower. "Correction," he finally said. "As much as I would be there for your uncle any day, I work for him and he pays me fair wages. These hiking boots are my favorite shoes, and I would not trust another brand to take me on those new explorations. And yes, I do write poetry." He gazed back at the sunset, a look of humor on his face. "Oh," he added, "and I only hit the gym 4 days out of the week." He smiled and shook his head, trying not to laugh. Virginia felt a little relieved that he was still talking to her. Well, good to be corrected. She leaned her head up against her pillar and gazed at the sunset. Even in the cold of the day, she could feel the sun's warm rays softly touching her face. Still, the wind was stronger higher up, and her hoodie was not enough to endure the mountain weather. She tried to hold it in, but could not help from shaking. Charles looked over and took notice of her condition. Without a second thought, he removed his leather jacket, leaned over, and placed it around Virginia's shoulders. "No, it's okay," she said. "I'm fine." Charles gave a warm smile. "Take it. It's freezing out here, and that hoodie of yours is not meant for this kind of mountain weather." Leaving his jacket on her shoulders, Charles leaned back against his pillar. "But won't you be cold?" she asked. "No, I'm used to this kind of weather. I grew up my whole life here." Virginia pulled the jacket over her shoulders like a blanket. She unfolded its collar to cover her cheeks when she noticed a faint aroma about her. She pulled the collar close to her nose and found his scent resting on the jacket. She smiled. "His smell is still on it." She looked up over the bridge of the collar at Charles, who was staring right back at her. "Thank you," she said. "My pleasure," said Charles, smiling. He then looked back at the sunset in the distance. Virginia, however, continued to stare at Charles. The light of the setting sun gave a new look to his Native American features. His dark brown eyes were sharp as they stared into the distance. A darker tan contrast in his skin was illuminated more as the light of the setting sun broke out into a deeper red tone. His high cheekbones were distinguished more, and his long, straight, jet black hair blew across his face in the wind's current. Virginia pulled the jacket collar closer to her face to hide her blushing cheeks. She turned her eyes and stared at the sunset while continuing to relax in the fragrance of his jacket. Virginia soaked in the vast, beautiful landscape around her, absorbing the entire scene. It seemed to be the first time she'd allowed herself to do so since she arrived. The mountains on either side of the valley were flush with trees of yellow, red, and orange leaves. The school below her did not look as bad when seen from above. The leaves blowing in the wind added a mysterious touch to the atmosphere. The sunset in the distance brought it all together, covering the valley in a blanket of bright layers of gold, orange, and red. "Beautiful, isn't it?" asked Charles. Virginia gazed at Charles from the corner of her eye and then looked back at the sunset. "Yes, it sure is." Charles turned his head back at Virginia. "If I may ask, what are you doing at Mason High this late in the evening? Most people usually are thrilled to leave this place as soon as they can." Virginia was unsure as to how to answer that question. The warning Rose Cohen had written in her diary always followed her, causing her to make sure that she did not say anything that could lead to the discovery of the book. "I was in the library," she finally said. "There was a place that I had heard about here that I thought existed, but after a long time of looking, I came to a dead end." "Yeah? What's this place you've heard of?" Virginia cautiously responded, unsure if her next words should be uttered. "Alaythia. I thought it was a real place. I did some research on it in the school library, hoping to find something that could lead me to my next point, but I came up empty-handed." "Where did you hear about Alaythia?" he chuckled. "So it is fake, then." "I'm not saying anything. I'm asking where you heard about Alaythia." Virginia paused for a moment. My uncle told me about it." "Ah, that would make sense. Your uncle knows most about the many stories of old." Virginia became even more depressed. All hope was gone. Charles saw her expression change. "What's wrong?" "It was just a stupid hiding place for rebellious lovers," replied Virginia, almost in tears. I'm confused, said Charles. What was? Virginia was too emotional to think clearly anymore. Oh, what does it matter anymore now? It was written by a woman who is obviously just a great, thrill-seeking poet. Ignoring Rose's warning, Virginia opened up to Charles. I found this diary in my uncle's house. It was written by a teenage girl named Rose Ann Marie Cohen. It contains her life, her adventures, and the love that she experienced in this vast unknown land called Alaythia. I tried so hard to find it for myself, but Virginia— Stop, interrupted Charles. His eyes were wide and worried. He spied over the edge of the clock tower. He turned and looked at the open trapdoor on the floor. He then gazed down at the parking lot and glanced at every corner of the school campus. He looked back at Virginia. Careful what you say. Virginia was now worried and confused. What? Why? What is it? Just trust me. There is a lot to talk about, but please don't bring that up out here. Virginia just took Charles's instruction and let the subject go. Charles then looked back down at the parking lot. Isn't that your Bronco down there? Virginia looked down with him. Yeah, sure is. You left your lights on. What? She looked closer at the vehicle and saw the faint lights barely on. How did you see that? It's not even completely dark yet, and my lights are the weakest beam of light I've ever known. Charles just smiled. Oh, it's just who I am, I guess. Well, the lights won't matter now anyway. The engine won't crank. Charles looked at her. It wouldn't? Yeah, I called my uncle about 30 minutes ago. He's on his way to pick me up now. Charles pulled his feet back up from the ledge. Well then, shall we go and wait for him? Oh no, I don't want to. This is the best time I've had in forever. Well, I guess we could. Here, let's go down and take a look at your truck, and we'll wait for your uncle to arrive in the meantime. Virginia smiled. Okay. Charles made his way to the trapdoor and climbed down first. Virginia followed and began to make her way down. Careful now, she heard him say from below. This is the worst ladder in the world. Virginia placed her feet through the door and onto the first step of the ladder. Carefully, she climbed down. She had gripped the ladder with her hands when she heard the first creaking noise. She stopped for a moment and then climbed down with even more caution. She made it down one more step, then to the next. Then to the step below her foot broke in half. The ladder slid towards the 2x4 railing and would soon be over the edge. The next stop was a 40-foot drop. Suddenly, she felt two strong hands grab her by the waist. Instantly, she was pulled off the ladder and away from the edge. The ladder continued to fall. It slid over the edge and plummeted to the floor. There was a brief moment of silence, followed by the sound of wood and concrete colliding. Virginia was in shock and still shaking. Am I alive? A few seconds passed before she realized the same pair of hands still held her waist. She opened her eyes and saw Charles's hands fastened firmly onto her. He held her close, away from the edge of the platform. She saw that his eyes were just as worried as hers. Are you okay? He asked. Virginia remained staring up at him. I think so. Charles slowly let her go, ensuring she could stand on her own 2 feet. You're sure now? Virginia was standing without any assistance. Yes, I'm okay. Charles let out a little timid laugh. Oh boy, that was quite a scare, huh? Yeah, it was. Well, we should probably continue down. Virginia blinked her eyes and shook her head. Come out of it, Virginia. Yeah, you're right. With Charles in the lead, they walked down the stairs together. As they reached the bottom, Virginia stopped to look at the broken pieces of ladder that remained on the concrete floor. She would have been with it too, if not for Charles. She turned her head back at him. Thank you, she said. Charles smiled. Of course. He opened the door to the tower, walked out, and held it open for Virginia, who followed closely. She pulled his jacket over her shoulders and followed Charles to the Bronco. Upon reaching the truck, he opened the driver's door and popped the hood. Then walking around, he raised the mouth of the beast wide open. Does the Bronco have a rod to brace the hood open? He asked. I don't see one connected to the truck. "Oh, wait," exclaimed Virginia. She ran to the bed of the truck, reached in and pulled out a metal broom rod. "Would this do?" Charles laughed at the sight of the broom rod. "A classic support. I'll wager money that your uncle left it back there for this very purpose." He braced the rod up underneath the hood of the truck for support. Charles spent the next several minutes looking through the Bronco's engine. The sleeves of his white shirt became covered with black stains. Virginia felt bad. He ruined his shirt. "Listen, you don't have to do this." "Oh no, I'm not stopping now," he said comically. "But your shirt, aren't you afraid of ruining it?" "What? And leave you here without a working truck? Where's the sacrifice?" She pulled his jacket over her shoulders even closer and smiled at him. "Ah, found it," he said at last. "What? What is it?" Charles pulled a long black band out of the engine and held it up for Virginia to see. "This is your serpentine belt. See how it's in one long strand?" "Yes." "It's supposed to be in a circle, like a band. It must have been broken sometime recently, possibly as you pulled into this parking lot." "Oh, will the truck still work?" "I think it'll be okay, but it's not going anywhere without a new belt. I can put one on when we get it back to your uncle's barn." Just then, a pair of headlights pulled into the parking lot of Mason High. Virginia noticed the truck instantly. "It's my uncle," she said excitedly. Andrew parked his truck up behind Virginia's Bronco and got out to greet them both. Virginia ran up and hugged her uncle. Andrew stood frozen for a few seconds and returned her hug by wrapping his big arms around her. "Well now," he exclaimed. "It's good to see you too, honey. What got you so excited?" "Oh, a lot." "Nothing," she replied. Andrew looked up at Charles. "Hey, Charles, did you find the problem with the truck by any chance?" Charles held out the broken belt for Andrew to see. "Ah, that'll do it." He looked down at Virginia. "Honey, why don't you hop into the truck and warm yourself up? I need to talk to Charles about something for a second." Virginia turned loose of her uncle and walked around to the passenger door. Before she reached out to open it, she remembered Charles's jacket. She slowly took it off. She walked back around, approached Charles, and handed him back his jacket. Charles extended the palm of his hand, refusing to take it. "Keep it," he said. "You'll need it out here." A big smile crossed Virginia's face, and she could not help but hug him. "Thank you." She walked to the passenger door and got inside the big white truck. Andrew walked closer to Charles. "How did things go today? Anything to be concerned about?" Charles reached into the Bronco and pulled out the keys. A stern look came over his face as he held them out for Andrew to take. "She knows." Andrew reached out and took the keys. "She knows what?" "About Alaythia." Andrew smirked and waved his hand in the air. "Oh, there's no reason to be worried about that. Alaythia is something that many in this town talk about." Charles grabbed a piece of paper from his notebook and wrote on it. "No, you don't understand. There's more." He handed the note to Andrew. "Don't read it out loud." Andrew read over the note in his hand. "She says she found a diary written by Rose Cohen in your house. She told me herself." He looked up at Charles with steady eyes. "What? Where in the house did she find it?" "She didn't say." "What now?" "It happened for a reason, Charles. Like you, I'm concerned, but we must remember that the rule of this matter is in higher hands than yours or mine. We will continue to trust Oral Muti and not worry. However, we will continue to stand on guard even more." "I already am," said Charles. Andrew turned and looked at his niece, who was sitting in the truck wrapped in her new jacket. She quickly turned her head away when she saw her uncle spotted her looking out the window at Charles. Andrew turned his head back towards Charles and smiled. "Yeah, I can see that you're taking extra caution while protecting my niece." A familiar color arose in Charles's cheeks. "Oh, stop. I'm only doing this. My only concern is... He saw that nothing was persuading Andrew, who was now laughing. "Oh, just stop. You're reading too deeply into it again." "Son, I've been on this earth for a long time, so don't you start telling me what is clearly before my eyes." "Andrew, please. What makes you think that she even... Here's how I know." Andrew walked over to the driver's door of his truck and opened it. "Virginia, I won't be able to take the truck into the shop until late tomorrow afternoon, so you won't be able to drive yourself to school tomorrow morning. Would you be okay if Charles took you himself?" Virginia's face lit up. Yes, that's fine." Andrew turned his head back towards Charles and raised one eyebrow. Charles stood there with wide eyes staring back at him. Andrew looked back at Virginia. "Okay, honey, I just wanted to make sure you were okay with it." He closed the door and looked back at Charles with a big grin stretching from ear to ear underneath his bushy mustache. Charles's dark skin went completely white. "Are you going to continue to argue with me anymore, son?" dared Andrew. At the silent reply of the boy, Andrew continued, "Be at my house to pick her up by 6 a.m. and not 1 second later." With nothing further to say, Andrew reopened his truck door and hopped inside. The powerful engine of the diesel truck roared as he and Virginia drove off the school property, leaving Charles behind, still frozen in his spot. "Smooth," he finally said. "Very smooth." He went to the hood of the Bronco and pulled the metal broom handle out from the jaws of the old monster, closing it with a loud chomp. He placed the handle and the broken belt inside the vehicle, hand-locked the door and closed it shut. And granted, brilliant. Very smooth and brilliant. He walked over to his truck and hopped in. Cranking up the engine, he drove off to his own home. The sun had set entirely over the horizon. There was no one on the school grounds except one man, dressed in dark clothing, standing in the shadows of the school building. His eyes glowed green in the night. The hood of his trench coat darkened the image of his face, shrouding his guise in the likeness of a phantom. He pulled a phone out of his pocket and made a call. "It's me," he said. "I found her."
This is the end of Chapter 6. Tune in next Thursday for Chapter 7. If you'd like to listen to the next chapter ad-free ahead of everyone else, then subscribe to Early Access and tune in on Sunday. If you like what you heard, please like and subscribe and share with your friends and family. It really helps the show. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major podcasting platforms. What Shines with the Dawn was written and created by C. Taylor Eason. Copyright Christian Taylor Eason, 2024.